if you can for a moment, place yourself in one of those stories from the Bible that make little to no sense to people like us sitting in the pews today. One where two tribes are pitted against one another in battle, a tribe whose name you might not remember or be able to pronounce or forgot on purpose or haven't read about in a long time. You're staring across a field or plain in the desert of the ancient Near East, and on one side is your people. On the other side, another. And you know that as this battle begins, one side will win and one side will lose, and the losers don't come out okay. In fact, none of you, particularly if you're soldiers or men, live. Those that do, or women or children in those eras, become property. You know that on the other side of this battle for one group is destruction of one kind or another. You've got crude weapons, at least to our modern sense. And everyone on your side you've known your entire life. You've traveled from place to place, your friends, your family, the people that have cared for your children, provided for your family's nurturance, and at the end of this thing, the world will change. Land that used to belong to someone won't anymore. Lives that used to exist won't. At the front of that battle, you are going to have a container that in some cases literally holds your God. So you know in Indiana Jones, when they have the Ark of the Covenant, that's what that is. In the ancient Near East, it was common in battle for tribes who had their own gods and goddesses or collections of gods to have a tangible sense that they were with them in that battle, would put them literally in a container and hoist them up as they marched into battle, saying, "This is the source of my strength. This is worth fighting for." The God Yahweh would be in the container, the ark for the Israelites in that time, a God who in the text later says, "You think you can fit me in a box?" The life or death consequences of that tribalism were very real for very good reasons. It wasn't just because people were brutal or violent. It was because in that context, life was dangerous enough, and more so without a tribe. Hospitality was a value because if a group of travelers came to your community and had sensed an offense or a slight, it could have consequences of dramatic proportions. So you had better treat that stranger with kindness. But when it was over, they, if they lost, had to go. Or else some of them might come back and try to get some of us. And so what seemed brutal or violent, not understandable to our context, was literally life and death. The good news, I'm assuming, is that for us who have found enlightenment and made their way into a Unitarian church, the disposition toward tribalism and labels that would assume other people are lesser than we has gone away a long time ago. Sermon over? We might not be in pitched battles for those of us in the pews with a visible God bearing our standard. Maybe. But the markers that those of us in the room still wear to mark who we belong to, what side we're on, what tribe we're a part of, and which we're not, are still very tangible in our lives. Think of all the ways that we in this room might show what side we're on. Maybe a shirt that shows who you voted for, or a political slogan. Maybe it's a yard sign that we sell at the bookshop as a way of telling your neighbors what you believe and why. A piece of jewelry with a religious symbol on it, a cross or a chalice or a Star of David. Something on your wrist. Maybe you chose the car you drive to make a statement about your environmental values or your disdain for PC culture. Think of how many things we do that are intended to send a message about which group we are in, which group we are not. You can tell a Unitarian church parking lot pretty easy. It's right there in our choices of consumption. You know how you call it a murder of crows and a crash of rhinoceros? I've come to calling it a Prius of Unitarians. Because for some reason we've decided that the box we move from place to place in should say something. When I first moved back to Dallas from living in Boston and Austin to take this job, I had grown up here but had not lived here in much of my adult life, and people gave me a lot of advice about which neighborhood I should live in. They were all explicit about it, and the advice had to do with how people voted in that neighborhood. Oh, you would love it over there. That's where all the Democrats are. It was as explicit as that, time and time again. You should choose your neighbors, Aaron, based on how they vote. As if that's just a thing, because it is. There was a study in 2008 from Colorado State University that looked at the way that people mark their homes and vehicles and their propensity to engage in acts of retaliation or violence, road rage. There was a correlation, and I know I have to be careful with so many scientists in the room, not a causation, but a correlation between people who said they would be willing to engage in road rage and those who had more bumper stickers and marks of statements on their cars. Which is not really an issue unless you Google Unitarian car. That's just the first thing that comes up. I'm just saying. Think of the many ways that we say in day-to-day life, this is the side I'm on, I need you to know. In our national context, those sides seem like they're more important than ever and fever-pitched with families being ripped apart over these issues. In our national context, we literally have people talking about blood and soil with literal neo-Nazis feeling comfortable marching in the streets again. With leaders at the highest level of government refusing to take a side between Nazis and people marching against them. The left and right growing further and further apart, and even in the lefty progressive circles that I run in, feeling like you have to prove that you are left of the left of the left of the left in order to belong, where the woker than thou are testing at every moment, and the people who are defensive against it are pushing back too. The strange reality being that as these tribal forces of us and them grow stronger and more powerful, it leaves those of us in the room feeling like we don't know if we belong. Because any group that can bring you in can also throw you out. And any group that promises you that you become righteous by being a part of it is one that will tell you how unrighteous you are when it asks you to leave. Now, in this church, we are called to a deeper kind of cultural and holy loyalty through our heritage of universalism. But it seems almost impossible to live up to that ideal sometimes. There's a guy named Rob Bell. He was a megachurch preacher in Michigan who came to the conclusion, about 15 years ago, that women should preach and God loved everybody, and he lost his job. He became what really is a universalist, but he didn't talk about being a universalist. He wrote a book called Love Wins. And when he writes about the Bible, he says that if you look back, there's all of these moments in the stories of people that to our modern critical eyes look like are doing barbaric, violent, tribal things, but at every step they're struggling with it, saying, this is not enough. He points to the story of Abraham being told that he will be the head of a tribe that will bless all human beings, which would have been unthinkable at the time. Your tribe only blessed your tribe, and your God was only your God, not everybody's. And the idea that this was a tribe that was meant to bless all the world would have been incredibly progressive. It just doesn't seem that way through our modern eyes. He points to the fact that in the Jesus story, you have the only example in the ancient Near East in which a tribe of people whose leader was brutally killed do not seek any revenge at all. He points to a group of people with all of their faults, like you and I, get the sense that this doesn't have to be this way. Universalism is the notion from progressive Christians hundreds of years ago that God, as a loving parent, would cast no human being aside. That there was no sin, no failure that was big enough to ever erase the love of God. They said, you better get used to loving your enemies now because you're going to spend eternity with them in heaven. And if men and women and people of all genders are equal in heaven, they need to be equal now. If people of all races will be equal in heaven, they need to be equal now in all religions, and therefore. It's an amazing idea that the vital, sustaining force of all creation itself is moving through you and all creation and all people, whether you like it or not. That everyone is worthy of love and justice without exception. And that's easy for me to say, and much harder for me to believe when it's no longer abstract. God loves everybody. It's so nice to say. God loves Steve. Or Joanna. Or, those people. You know how they voted, right? You know what church they go to? You know what they did? All of a sudden, this thing gets more complex. It's a standard that can feel very challenging to live up to. In our history, there are these people who stand up as actually having taken an experience of a love that knows no bounds and living it in practical, tangible ways that can serve as examples to us. One of them I think about is a man named George de Benneville, who I like to lift up a lot in church settings here because he holds one of our only Unitarian Universalist miracle stories. We don't have a lot of them, but his is one of them. George de Benneville was a French Huguenot who was born in the early 1700s. He was a pain to live with. A really horrible human being to be around, even as a 10-year-old. So much so that the people in his life decided that he would be a lot better way out in the ocean away from other human beings. So they signed him up to work on a merchant ship when he was a little kid and sent him off. Goodbye, George. Good riddance. While he was working on those boats, he came in relationship with a group of black Muslims who in his time would have been referred to as Moors. One of the men on the boat had fallen and cut open his leg, and his compatriots had gathered next to him and were praying and crying tears into the wound to try and heal it. George de Benneville had grown up hearing that he was righteous and other people were heathens. And in that moment, watching this act of compassion, he recognized that he was the one on the wrong side of God's understanding. He went to his room and he wept, worried that he had gotten everything wrong. He becomes a preacher of what we would call universalism now, but he had to do it in secret because it was illegal. And so in the woods in Germany and France in the early and mid-1700s, he would have these universalist revival services so illegal that he was sentenced to death 3 times, each time barely getting away because of a letter from a governor, a powerful figure. And then he had a moment. He got sick and caught a fever. A fever that was so strong that everybody in his life thought he was dead. His brother built a coffin just for him, and placed his body in. And, like in a Monty Python sketch, he wasn't dead yet. But everybody thought he was. And in that moment, for 48 hours, lying in his own coffin, he had a Dante Alighieri-style fever dream in which God took him from the depths of hell all the way up through purgatory and heaven, where he met every human being who had ever existed. He met the prophets and Jesus and Noah and Moses and Adam and Eve. He got up to God, where God looks at him and says, "George," as God does, I need to let you know that every religion, every creed, every Bible, every church service, every human you've ever met who had something to say about God was giving voice to an intangible, symbolic reality beyond all human knowing, whose love is so expansive that it knows all people, all races, all creeds, all religions, and genders. My love will never stop for any human being. Wake up and go tell everybody. And so he did. He literally got up from his own coffin, surprised the heck out of all of his friends and family, became a very popular preacher, as you would if you got up out of your own coffin. Moves to what would become the United States during the colonial era and the Revolutionary War, and starts this Universalist tangible revival center on his farm in Pennsylvania, where he invites women to preach for some of the first times in the United States, native tribal elders to preach and lead services under his home where a river flowed. People of all faiths and creeds were able to lead religious services, this kind of tangible, heaven on earth universalism. Then the Revolutionary War started. The Battle of Cherry Hill was on his property, and 2 British officers were killed. Nobody would let those filthy traitors and tyrants be buried on their property. Except George. They came with the bodies of 2 officers and said, "We can't find anyone else to bury them." And he said, "Well, just by coincidence, when I died, went to hell, heaven, purgatory, and met Jesus and all the saints, God told me that all religions are merely symbols of a universal love that knows no bounds. So sure, you can bury them at my place." Now, I wonder how many of you in this room would let the Senate Majority Leader in your house. Let alone to say the people who tried to kill me, let them stay next to me forever. If you go to George de Benneville's home today in Pennsylvania, you'll see his grave and his wife's, and the bodies and graves of 2 enemy British soldiers there still. And that's great for George. And what are we going to do about it? It just feels trickier to me. That's nice. It's a story that happened a long time ago. Don't we need to take a side right now? When there's neo-Nazis on the streets, don't we need to take a side? When the world is on fire and our children and teenagers in this church and my kids worry whether there will be enough water to live in their lifetime, don't we need to take a side? This is a question that came up in one of our adult Sunday school classes in the last couple of weeks. Yes, these examples are wonderful, but it doesn't do enough to just say God loves everybody. What are we supposed to do? Good question. I think when there are neo-Nazis in the streets and the world is on fire, you do have to take a side. But how you take that side makes all the difference. Remember that any side you ever take, whether it's in a family dispute, a political disagreement, a church, or a city, is a theological claim. And you might not be in the Near East with a God in a container, but you are holding up the reality you believe is worthy of a fight. Maybe it's your self-preservation and sanity. Maybe it's justice or peace. Maybe it's compassion or love, but when you get in a fight and take a side, pay attention to which God you are lifting up and who the group that's asking you to do it wants you to hate. Because whether or not we like it, every group shows disdain for others at some point, and will give you subtle or explicit clues about who is worthy of God's love or yours. Conservatives and progressives, Baptists and Unitarians, everyone in between. Every side you ever take on an important issue is a theological claim. Now, that doesn't mean that a tribe is a bad thing. Yesterday afternoon, I had the bittersweet honor of officiating the wedding for a couple, one of whom is believed to live for another few days. Their entire family showed up in force. Members from this church gathered to sing at that wedding and take pictures at that wedding, to bring cakes and provide the most normal environment or celebratory environment possible for a person who had less than a week left on earth. That's a good tribe. That's a tribe of people whose standard bearer and God was love and compassion and presence, and it was worth it. And if you are alone and wondering whether you're at home in your body or on this earth because of who you love or the body you move through the world in, this can be a good tribe. If you haven't heard the words, "I love you," all week, or you haven't touched a human hand all week and you are desperately lonely and wondering where you belong, this can be a good tribe and a holy community that will honor you. But don't ever let us off the hook if we start to pretend that some people are actually less deserving of compassion than others. Don't you ever let us off the hook, because any community that promises that you are holier and done with all of your work because you're a part of them is not doing its job. And any place that tells you other people are not worthy will one day say the same thing to you. Every time you make a choice, pay attention. What is that group asking me to hold up as worthy of a fight? Who are they asking me in subtle or explicit ways to disdain? You get to decide which God you lift up in those decisions. We only have one life exactly like this. Some things will be worthy of a fight. Choose wisely. And amen.